you have your camera off and your mic muted, and it should be okay. Angelique is someone who's come to us from the private sector. A couple things about her: she's been coaching professionally, executive coaching, for 15 years, and has just kind of a wealth of experience in that field. She also has done training and development for many years. She joined our team about 4 months ago, and she was born in Provo, Utah, but lived mostly in Canada for the last several decades. And so she comes to us from Canada, from the private sector. So she brings a little diversity to our team. She has a private pilot's license, by the way. That's an interesting fact about her. She's flown coast to coast, and she has 3 grown children. Let me introduce to you Angelique Meyer. She's going to take us through this today, leading and influencing remote teams. Angelique.
Great. Well, thank you for that lovely introduction, Rick. Good morning, everyone. It's nice to meet you.
Good morning.
Yes, good morning. Okay. Let me find my controls here. Yes, also the next Off the Shelf is going to be on Wednesday, February 22nd, with Dan Chase, and he is going to take us into the world of leading with emotional intelligence. And so that'll be our next topic for February.
By the way, we'll send out a link to sign up for that session later on today. Thanks for reminding me, Angelique, I was supposed to do this slide.
That's
Thanks
okay.
for rolling with it.
That's okay. We're a team.
Yeah, that's right. Anyway, back to Angelique.
That's in pairs.
Right.
All right. So Rick's going to be managing the chat box if you want to put any comments or any questions in the chat. But typically, this presentation, I just keep going. And I'll leave some time at the end for any questions or discussions. All right, this session is designed to develop leadership competencies that are critical to leading remotely. We will see how to leverage practices that will help us in supporting accountability with our teams. Then we will look at the best influencing approach. And to bring it all together, we will learn the best ways to foster strong connections and create a sense of belonging with our teams. So despite apprehensions from some leaders have towards remote work, the science tells us that it mainly has positive impacts. For example, employees tend to feel more autonomous and in control when they have the opportunity to work remotely. As they get used to working remotely, they get better at managing work-family conflicts and report less and less perceived stress. The negative impacts on remote work on productivity is mostly a myth. In the last decade, some organizations, after experimenting with remote work, called their remote workers back into the office. Result? No gains in productivity were observed. In some cases, there was impact on employee morale, and we saw more sick leave and vacation requests. Gallup studies show that highly engaged workplaces can claim lower absenteeism and higher productivity. Virtual workers report 60% higher intent to stay than employees in traditional office settings. And I know that a lot of us have been faced with this: is how do we retain employees? And so this research is actually good for us to know that offering some flexibility increases the chance of us keeping our employees. Now, there are mixed results when it comes to the impact of remote work on the relationship quality. When provided sufficient autonomy, remote work generally improves, and so does the quality of the supervisor relationship. Negative impacts on the workplace relationship quality can arise when employees spend most of their time remotely. It is a risk factor remote leaders must consider. But when managed properly, remote work has little impact on the relationship quality. And that's where I want to spend our time today: relationship quality. Right? So, because that's where we really have the most autonomy as leaders, is the quality of the relationships that we have with our team members. So let's dive into it. Leadership is still leadership, whether you lead a remote team or lead in the office. Today, we will look at leadership practices and skills that are applicable in both contexts. So first, let's look at the specific roles remote leaders are expected to endorse. So to be a leader, so unleash energy and enthusiasm by inspiring and motivating others with vision. Now, when I say that, some of you are thinking, well, I'm not unleashing energy onto anybody. I'm more the laid back leader. So when I say unleashing energy and enthusiasm by inspiring and motivating, what I'm really referring to is the vision. What vision do you have for your team? So let's pick a date. Let's just say December 31st. At the end of the year, what is the vision you have for your team? What are you celebrating? What did your team together accomplish? Like, that's the vision. So by communicating and setting the vision for the team, right, that's how you can be inspirational and motivational with your team. Now, be a results catalyst. Focus people on getting good results. Help boost performance without being authoritarian. Manage by principle, not policy. Use boundaries and not directives. Be a facilitator. Assemble necessary tools, data, and resources, and facilitate group efforts. Be a barrier buster. Run interference for the team, open doors, and break down artificial barriers that block teams' performance. Be a business analyst. Now, this means grasping the big picture, translate changes in the business environment into opportunities, and act as a customer advocate, right? Really being able to disseminate the big picture, what is going on in your agency, in your department, and show your team how these changes are opportunities for them and, of course, your team. So be a coach. Teach others, help them develop, and ensure their accountability. And of course, the most important is to be a living example. Serve as a role model by demonstrating the behaviors you want your team members to practice. Show them how the team can be successful together. So that kind of ties back to the beginning when I talked about vision. It's the same thing, right? Tell them what's important to you. Tell them the vision of the team. And then walk the talk, right? Do behaviors that will get you to that vision, and then your team has a higher chance of following. So basically, walk the talk. So the first practice is supporting accountability. In the remote world, leaders need to make a slight shift from clarifying roles and responsibilities, or, our typical how we will do the job, to the bigger picture. Why does any of this matter? So really focusing more on the outcome. Actually, this is a fundamental shift, right? Getting away from the details and more focusing on the bigger picture. Autonomous employees are more productive remotely. To foster autonomy, you should avoid the micromanagement trap. Author Daniel Pink has done research on this topic and found that us humans need the opportunity to direct our own life and work. To be fully motivated, we must be able to control what we do, when we do it, and with who we do it. According to Pink, autonomy motivates us to think creatively and to get the job done. So when we're experiencing a situation where we feel little control, there is a biological stress response that is activated. The same is true when we perceive that our status is threatened, when our role as leaders is being redefined. Now, I know over the last 3-4 years that your roles as leaders definitely have been redefined. And everyone's automatic reaction is to react to that change in some way. Our brain is a threat detector, and with this stress response is activated, your brain will react either the fight, flight, freeze, or flock. One of those things depends on your personality style. When we first experience remote work, some leaders may have felt helpless, they may have done the freeze response, or they may have become distant and passive. That's more the flight response. So just take a second and think back when we first entered into the remote work. What was your response as a leader? You probably had one or maybe more of these reactions. Then over time, you kind of settle into your new role, find what works and what doesn't work. So a more common response in leaders is to try and regain control by engaging in micromanagement practices. Some of you may be guilty of this, some of you may be still doing this, and some of you may have been on the other end of experiencing what micromanagement practices are like. So how can we move away from micromanager to macro manager? So macro management doesn't mean letting go of control. It's about shifting the focus of control. You should focus away from the details of the execution and towards the goals and objectives, towards the why and away from the how. Allow employees to figure out the best way to reach those goals and objectives and show flexibility to let them be productive on their own terms. Focus on recognizing their results, efforts, and other desirable behaviors like engagement, autonomy, and communication skills. Remember, we always focus on, what they're doing right. So catch them doing something right and emphasize what's working. Also, being an effective macro manager is also a balancing act, deciding when to step back, when to jump in, and when to provide guidance and coaching, right? So there isn't necessarily a prescription for this. It's a constant juggling act or balancing act of when you're going to be more involved or be less involved. And it takes time and practice to understand what works best for you and your team. So I have 4 key practices that we can do to help us be more of a macro manager in the remote work environment. So the first one is about goal setting. Trust and open culture is a condition for success in remote work. Setting specific, measurable, realistic, and challenging goals with shared accountability systems will empower your team. That requires setting clear responsibilities with metrics that gauge progress and success. To help you do that, you can think in terms of the end result goals and progress goals, right? So not necessarily the details, but think about the end. Remember, we talked a little bit about vision before. What will get us to the vision of the team and how we define success for our team. Focus on just the critical process and end result goals to avoid the micromanagement trap. Now, the next one is flexibility. Once you have set goals and objectives, you can get out of the way and let employees be productive on their own terms. The most effective course is to simply decide that you trust them. If they get their work accomplished, stop worrying about what else they may or may not be doing. A command and control approach will instantly convince them that you don't trust them. Judge performance, not the schedule. Discuss with employees the specific life circumstances, for example, adequate work space, family constraints, and help them define clear boundaries to better manage work-personal conflicts, as these tend to blur when working remotely. Now, the next one, recognition. Being flexible doesn't mean being laid back. We invite you to actively focus your attention on catching people being right. You can express recognition for individuals as person with their specific character and contributions beyond work. You can also express recognition towards the work they're doing in terms of quality and competency. Efforts and progress are another target for recognition. Anytime you see someone engaged in a process goal, you have the opportunity to recognize the efforts that should drive results to reinforce those behaviors. And finally, you can recognize results aligned to end results goals. This is the target for recognition that is most obvious to most managers. Still, we invite you to express recognition in all of the areas. Now remember, just a little side note here. Some people love public recognition and some people do not. Get to know your team and understand when you should be recognizing folks in private and take the opportunity to recognize other folks publicly, right? It just depends on their personality style. And if you don't know which employee enjoys private recognition versus public recognition, you can just ask them. Or try giving them public recognition and see what happens, right? They'll let you know right away whether they enjoy that or not. Okay, and the fourth key practice, come on, I'll have to click here, is coaching. A key success is the amount of meaningful feedback that team members are getting from each other and their leaders. In general, fully remote workers should be receiving meaningful feedback a few times per week. Now, I put a caveat on that. You know your team. If you have a long-standing relationship with your team, they may not need feedback a few times a week. If you're a new manager or leader to a certain team, you should be giving meaningful feedback a few times a week until you can establish a relationship with each team individual. So I say that with a caveat, just getting to know your people. Step in where needed to help, but also establish regular one-on-one coaching sessions with each employee. Now, when I say coaching sessions, it doesn't have to be a formal 1-hour coaching session. It could be what we call like a check-in, just understanding what your team member needs. This builds rapport and creates expectation that your discussions with the team member are meant to help them succeed. Okay, define a frequency to which you will ask, how can you help your employee? And then ask for feedback. Ask how, not if you can help. Just a subtle change, right? Instead of saying, is there anything I can help you with, right? Ask, how can I help you? It just puts the team member in a different headspace, right? Gets them to think from a different part of their brain. So ask for feedback to identify what works and what doesn't work, to find ways to be more effective in connecting with them. For example, treat others how they want to be treated, right? So really taking the opportunity to know your team members and to see, what works for them, because what works for one person isn't going to work for everyone. And identify the things that you do well and that you would benefit to do more often. So being a leader is an iterative approach or process, right? You've got to think about what your style was a couple of years ago may not be the appropriate style today. So as leaders, we need to evolve ourselves as our team evolves. So when you ask for feedback, you can show up confidently vulnerable, and in doing so, you will inject trust into the relationship. So you're going to hear me talk a lot about trust, and trust is a key foundation for many, many things, but it's definitely a building block in relationships. And there's many things that we can do to build trust, and there's many things that we don't realize that erode trust. Okay, so influencing remote teams. This is the second part. So usually we just talk about leading remote teams, and I added the influencing part because I felt it's important that it needs to shift and modify in remote teams just as much as our regular leadership behaviors. So I added the influence part, and influence has long been recognized as an essential element of leadership, but it's different when it comes to remote teams. So a commonly used definition of leadership states that leadership is a process of social influence in which one person is able to enlist the aid and support of others in the accomplishment of a common task. Right? Influence is a primary social mechanism through which a leader enacts his or her leadership. And working remotely has changed the social mechanisms, has changed where we physically engaged with each other. John Maxwell has many famous quotes on leadership. I like this one because it relates to the importance of recognizing that we're all human beings, not just our titles. So let's look at some distinguishing differences in influencing with a remote team. So in the early 80s, there was some foundational research that was done that is the basis of all mainstream research on influencing behavior. This research has led to the identification of 9 influence approaches. 3 of them are known as hard tactics, and 6 of them are soft tactics, right? So the hard tactics on the left, right, are simple, straightforward. Leaders carry them out simply. Most of us can do this, have been conditioned to lead this way. But it's more focusing on ourselves. We're building on our own perspective. Now, the other ones, the soft tactics, the one on the right, are more complex and require the ability to influence based on the follower's perspective, characteristics, and inner motivators. Right? These ones are more focused on others. Now, in remote leading or being a remote leader, I think it's more effective that we focus on others, right? Really putting our focus on how our team members are coping, reacting, linking their day-to-day job to the vision of the team. So now, none of those tactics are right or wrong or good or bad. It just depends on the situation on when to use them. So hard influence works better when there's limited change involved, right? People know what they need to do. There's not a lot of change, right? The required task is routine or standard, right? It's simple and clear. There isn't a lot of nuance in the task to be performed. Or if there is an emergency, right? A sense of urgency or a time pressure. So think about in an emergency, you want to be very directive as a leader. Basically, if the house is on fire, we want to get out of the house immediately, right? Those are an extreme example of hard influence. So under those conditions, it's better to use hard influence tactics. Now, in conditions or situations when they're a dynamic environment and when decisions need to be taken across the organization. And I think about some of the decisions we need to make, inside our departments. It is a dynamic environment. We're getting new information as rules and processes change, right? We need to change and adapt. So this is why soft influence tactics can be more effective. Or when the task is complex and requires extra effort. Or in situations of ambiguity and needed to empower people to make decisions at lower levels, right? The soft influence tactics become more effective. So some other considerations. Hard approach is effective in terms of cost and time. And that's why a lot of us default to this one. It's the most cost-effective way to lead. Soft approaches are more effective in gaining commitment. And that's the nuancing to leading remotely, is trying to gain commitment, build trust, impart the vision, right? And that's where the soft approaches can be more effective. Now, inspirational leadership, as you saw on the last slide, inspirational leadership was the last one there. And it really talks about vision. I'll tie it back to the vision. What is your vision for the team? What is important to you? That's how you can be inspirational, is by connecting your team's day-to-day work to the vision, the overall vision of where we're going, or what does success mean to you. So here are some tips for practicing soft influence. Share information often with everyone. The best approach to influencing is letting well-researched data do the convincing, making sure that you're sharing as much as you can, as soon as you can, with everyone. Smile. Bring emotion and friendliness to a message. It's easily forgotten in a virtual conversation that we can be smiling when we're typing a message, but it's entirely invisible to the reader. And add positivity to chats, and colleagues may be more willing to consider new views. So like emojis, right? Play with the emojis or some other way of being more playful, right? Because sometimes we can read a lot of emails and messages and it all tends to get very serious. But we want to make sure that, that we're adding some fun in there too. Collaborate. Ask for others' opinions before sharing your own view. This is going to be a hard one for some folks because a lot of us grew up thinking that the leader was being paid because you have all the answers, right? And it's your job to impart your pearls of wisdom onto your team. But this is a bit different, asking others to share first, right? And then check to see if the solution suggested is one that will solve the problem for others, right? Because maybe your way, your view isn't necessarily the only way that things can be done. And this is a great way to engage team members. Seek input to create even better possibilities. Provide others the freedom to choose, right? Remember, we talked a little bit about autonomy and how important autonomy is, right? So this is another way to offer autonomy. And of course, remember, this approach takes longer, so you will need to practice. I myself personally am really big on efficiency. So as a leader, I like to tell and I like to do things quickly. But what I've realized over the years, that even though that feels okay for me, that's not the best way to engage a remote team, right? It's better to engage others, to engage in small talk, to let others share their vision or their approach, and not always have to rely on what I think is the best way. All right, so the third one is fostering connections. When you share a physical workspace with your team, your day is filled with opportunities for spontaneous conversation. You can stop by someone's cubicle and ask how their weekend it was, so you can quickly pop your head into a team member's office and get clarification on a project issue or catch up on your day over lunch. These casual conversations might seem trivial, but the truth is they're part of what brings your team together. Unfortunately, these opportunities for spontaneous, casual conversation aren't so readily available for remote distributed teams. But just because those conversations don't happen as naturally in a remote team doesn't mean that they're not just as important. And so part of effectively leading remote teams is creating space for those conversations to happen. Now, some of us do it more naturally than others. So Kristen Sings wrote a book called The Power of Curiosity: How to Have Real Conversations That Create Collaboration, Innovation, and Understanding. So conversations aren't effective when people aren't emotionally triggered, or when they are emotionally triggered, or generally not listening. So she spent a lot of time putting the value on being curious. So as the leader, be more curious, generally seeking to understand rather than presuming and rushing to judgment, being able to learn about others, or just generally being interested in the other person. Now, for some of you, this is obvious. This is, well, I do this every day anyway. For others of us, we have to work at it. And I'm saying us because I put myself in that bucket too. I'm not naturally as curious, right? I value efficiency and productivity. So to really embrace this, I've had to spend some time thinking about, how can I be more curious? How can I be more genuinely interested in other people? And it's a process. It doesn't happen overnight. So most of you have probably seen this breakdown in communication statistics before. However, I think it's important to repeat here because it's such a pivotal point to remember in conversation, especially in remote teams. So in adults, 55% of communication comes from nonverbal cues, such as body language. Well, that's a huge portion if you don't have your cameras on or you're not seeing somebody physically. That's a lot of information that is lost. 38% of our communication comes from our voice, tone, and pace. How we say things, where we put the emphasis. There's a lot of information in our tone of voice. It can indicate the importance of a particular point or if we're just joking about something. And of course, only 7% of communication comes from our words, which is crazy if you think about that breakdown, right? Only 7% comes from our words. So in an email or a chat, there is a lot that's missing. So you can see that there's a disadvantage when we only use words to communicate. So the emotional connection becomes fragile in remote teams and can leave room for misinterpretation. So what can we do about this deficiency? Leaders need to be present in every conversation, right? We need to get out of the way and put the focus on the other person. This means to listen more and to be present. Seems simple, but in practice, it's harder to do. Being present looks like limiting distractions. Don't try and multitask while in a conversation. Turn your phone to silent, etc. Shifting from telling to asking more questions. How and what questions, because these are open-ended questions. Telling can create conflict and burnout. Asking builds engagement through encouraging innovation, feedback, and free exchange of ideas. When we take over the conversation, we shut down the other person and reinforce that our opinion matters more. Now, some of you, this is a habit, and we need to be conscious as leaders to make sure that we're not shutting down our team members when they're trying to express themselves. Now, if you have a lot of introverts in your team, they need time to respond. And so in virtual meetings, give them a few seconds to actually respond, create the space for them to respond. The lesson is connecting on a personal level and instilling empathy with your team is undoubtedly important when working remotely. And then the 84% at the bottom, this was a complex, PricewaterhouseCoopers did a survey and put out some research on the complexity of trust. And of course, yes, what we found is that trust is very complex, right? It's easy to build, but it's also very easy to destroy. And it's something as leaders we should constantly be working on to maintain those trusting relationships with our clients with our team members. Okay, so how to foster connections. So turn your video on. There is video fatigue from too much on-camera time, I know, but strategically to use the video when your intention is to build relationships. Allow small talk in meetings. A few minutes of small talk in a meeting is an excellent way of releasing tension and promoting team members to share their experiences, which again fosters connection. I know this can be hard when we're in back-to-back meetings, and then to invite small talk can seem like a waste of time, but there really is a lot of camaraderie and trust and goodwill that is built in small talk. Practice your listening skills, right? Sounds simple, but true empathetic listening is more than just hearing the words so you can respond. It's understanding the other person's perspective, which means you will need to slow down your response and reflect on what is being said. And I know it's hard in the virtual world to have dead air time. There's that need to fill the space. This can be uncomfortable for many personality types. But if your intention is to grow connections, then practice this often. I know I was really good at doing it for about a year, and then I kind of fell back into my old ways. And then I remind myself it's really important to engage and let other people share how, their thoughts and how they're doing. And I don't always need to comment on everyone's stories, because that was a bad habit of mine. I used to comment on everybody's stories, and it's like you don't need to do that. Flexibility is key. Sometimes things are going to get done differently than you would like it. Practice letting go of control. The goal here is to allow for innovation and engagement from team members. Now remember, not everybody is quick to jump in. So when you say, does anybody have any comments on that? Allow time. Don't just give a second of silence and then move on to something else. Sometimes introverts need much more time to process the question. So give them a chance to internalize the question that you just asked them. And of course, build team goals together. Now, when possible, sometimes it's not possible to build team goals together. But if you can, have the whole team weigh in on setting goals for the year, quarter, or month. When we create our goals, we tend to be more invested in the outcome. So if you set goals and give them to your team, they're not going to be nearly as invested as if they were to build them with you. Now, of course, you as a leader, if you have certain goals that you must hit, how about trying to let the team come up with them together with you? You'll eventually get to the same outcome, right? Just allow them to participate in the process, if you can. I mean, sometimes you can't. So let's look at the other side, what to avoid. So common mistakes to avoid when managing remote teams. Not creating enough space for conversations. As managers, it's up to you to create an environment that fosters conversation and within your virtual team. Check with your virtual team members at the beginning of every one-on-one and ask how things are going, both professionally and personally. Now, if you're the type that, that comes easy to you and you definitely want to get into what's going on with them personally, make sure that you put a time limit on. Like there's a balance here. It's not all casual conversation and understanding where they are personally. It's got to be a mix or a balance of both. So schedule an end of the week happy virtual hour where the only agenda item is to hop on the video and catch up with your team. I know when I first saw that, I thought, that doesn't work for everybody. We can't just hop on a call at the end of every week. But if you can, it's a great way to wrap up the week and catch up on what everybody's been working on and how everyone's doing. Now remember, because there is no water cooler talk in a virtual environment, right? This is a way of replacing those casual, spontaneous conversations. Now, the next one, keeping communication strictly digital. So in 2018, Harvard Business Review did an article on how to collaborate effectively with remote teams. If you want your virtual team to succeed, you need to be able to communicate freely and effectively, right? And again, some of us are more naturally better at that, and some of us need to really work at that. So while digital channels can certainly be part of your communication, they shouldn't be the entire communication. And I know a lot of us that are more on the introverted side, more reflective, just sending out emails or chat is much more efficient and it's much more comfortable for us. So if you're the type that just relies on emails and chats, make it a point at least once per week to put in your calendar to have some live in video meeting with your team. Now, some of you are going to say, oh, I do that anyway. And then there's some of you that are very guilty of never communicating directly, like spontaneously with your team. Now, the other thing is rushing through meetings. Now, I'm guilty of this because remember, I'm really high on efficiency and productivity. So I love to rush through meetings. If I can end early, I will. But when you're having an in-person meeting, it's a lot easier to run things like a conversation. People can easily chime in when they have something to share in real time. In virtual meetings can be a little more challenging because they're not actually in the room. A virtual team member might not feel comfortable interrupting the speaker to give their input. So put a little sticky note there. Not everybody is comfortable interrupting the speaker. So we need to make sure that we give time for people to speak up and not have to interrupt us. If you're rushing through a remote team meeting, some folks might never see the opportunity to speak up and contribute in a real way. And as the manager, you'll lose out on their thoughts and their contributions and their input. If your remote team isn't contributing as much in your virtual meetings as you'd like, it could be because you're not giving them the time and the space to do so. Make sure you pause regularly during the meetings to give your remote team a chance to have the floor. And remember, don't accept silence as agreement. And the last one there is not setting the standard for your team. Perhaps the biggest mistake you can make when managing a virtual team is talking the talk without walking the walk. Do you tell your team members to show up to a virtual meeting on time as a must, but then show up 10 minutes late? Do you say that what's important for everyone is to respect the team's work-life balance, but then shoot off emails to your team all weekend? If you want the remote team to thrive, sending those kinds of mixed messages isn't going to fly. Your team is going to look at the standards you set for what is acceptable and what is not acceptable. So it's important to embody these values that you want to inspire with your team. It's kind of like that living example we looked at that slide on the 7 roles of a remote leader, is to be that living example. Okay, so I'll recap, moving from micromanager to macromanager. Shift your focus from how, the details, to the bigger picture, the why. So be inspirational in conveying the bigger picture. So I was talking about setting the vision, like having a vision for your team for this year. And I think it would be worthwhile to go through an exercise with your team is, define success? What does success look for your team by the end of the year or the quarter? A soft approach for influence works better in a remote environment. Elevate your leadership to an inspirational approach when you are setting the why. Why do you care? Why should they care? Right? And I tied this one back to the vision. Make sure that you're sharing your vision. Be fully present in your conversations. Put all of your attention over on the other person. Be curious about them and what is happening in their world. We want to inspire them to figure out their own way of doing things. We can support them by giving them a vision of where we need to get this. And of course, remember, stop telling people what to do. Stop giving your advice. Right? I know this is hard for a lot of folks because, again, we have that old programming that the leader must know everything, and therefore we must be espousing our advice all the time. You will be surprised at the level of engagement and creativity that comes from this level of autonomy, that you not always giving your advice. Allow people to make their own decisions, come up with their own game plan or their own goals, right? And see what happens. right? Because remember, we talked a little bit about goals are better if they come up with them rather than you telling them what their goals are. So really make it a practice to let other people figure out what works best for them. And it's easier for them to do that if they understand the vision of the team, right? If they understand where they're headed, it's easier for them to come up with goals. So you provide the big picture, the scope, and let them come up with the pieces that fit into that. All right, so now I'd love it if we would take just a few minutes and write down a couple of takeaways from this session. So just as a reminder, that's important for any training for us to use it, right? If we don't use it, then we'll forget the information. So just jot down 2 things that you'll take away. Hopefully one of them is to cover the vision with your team, like write a little sticky note on your screen and just review the vision of your team. Hopefully that's one of them. And then another one would be do some reflecting activity. How much do you spend telling everybody what to do versus asking people how they're doing and what they're doing, right? So just maybe think about how often do you do that and where can you get better telling versus asking. Those are the 2 things that I like to practice. And of course, I'm spending a lot of time this year on curiosity. How can I be more curious about others? All right. So that's the end of the slides. And I'm just going to stop presenting here and come back to the main room. And I'm going to look at the chat here and see.
Angelique, most of the questions in the chat were kind of answered along while we were going along. One example was given that I didn't get a chance to point out to you, but an example early on of an open-ended question. What questions do you have versus do you have any questions?
Yes, don't ask, do you have any questions? Because do you have any questions is a yes/no question, right? You can answer yes or no to that. An open-ended question are typically how and what questions, right? Sometimes, and I'll go through the why questions because there's been a lot of chat about, we should never use why questions. Only use why questions if the relationship with the person is solid, like you have an intimate relationship with somebody and they trust you, right? Then you can use why. Why do you think that? Or, why didn't this happen? But if you have a lot of authority, think about your boss's boss. If your boss's boss walked into the room and asked you, why didn't you do that? You would probably freak out, right? Because that would be very intimidating. But if the relationship is a symbiotic relationship, you have a lot of rapport, there's a history there and trust, then you can ask why. But primarily try and stick to the how and what questions. How can I help? How far did you get on that? Or where are we at? Right? So you can use where too. But really try and stick to the how and what questions and give the person an opportunity to answer. Right? And it's easy for them to say, oh, well, I've done this. And then for us as leaders to jump in and judge their answer. So the second part to that is try not to judge their answer, right? Making sure that we're giving them time to fully complete their thought. And I'm totally guilty of this because my rhythm is usually a little bit faster. So when I ask somebody, oh, how are you doing on that? And then they answer me, then I want to comment on their answer immediately. So one of the practices I put into place is try not to comment or tell or give advice on their answer. Just remain silent. So smile, that was silent and smile together. So smile and just be silent for a second and see if there's anything else that they want to add to it. A lot of people don't feel comfortable adding to it if you're jumping in and jumping all over it. So if you're more on the introverted side, that's natural for you. You do that naturally. If you're more on the extroverted side, your tendency is going to be to jump in and comment on what they just said.
A couple of comments have come through, Angelique, on reinforcing what you're saying here. Denise Hawes says, I need to learn to listen more and not rush to tell people what to do. I
Yeah.
value my autonomy and need to work on giving it to others. And then Carrie Lundeen says, I really like that. Don't ask why. I've seen the why question set people on edge.
Yeah. And that's not the intention. The intention, if you like your autonomy, make sure that we're giving other folks lots of autonomy as well.
Hey, folks, I should point out in the chat, you'll find a link to register for next month's Off the Shelf with Dr. Dan Chase about leading with emotional intelligence. You should be able to find it there in the chat. If you don't see it there, let me know and I'll send it to you again. One more question here for you, Angelique. Any tips on how to help remote teams feel more engaged and connected with one another?
Absolutely, yes. And so remember the water cooler example, like folks would just naturally bump into each other and have those casual conversations. That doesn't happen in the virtual world. So there was one example at the end of the week. It doesn't have to be at the end of the week. We're just saying at the end of the week, have a specific dedicated time. We used to call it martini hour. Where everyone would come in and we would just share, what happened, what we're working on, anybody going on vacation, was anybody's birthday coming up, like just some casual stuff. Somebody got a new pet, just the opportunity to share and connect. I was collapsing two words there too. So to share and connect, right? But if you don't offer those opportunities, we will bypass that, right? Because as human beings, we like to simplify and streamline our life and our work. So we as leaders, if we don't institute and put in some sort of casual gathering opportunities, chances are your team isn't going to do it for you. So that is one thing that you do need to institute as the leader. It can be a Wednesday thing, it can be a Monday thing, it can be a Friday thing. I don't know. Find something that works for your team and have that casual hour where you share. You figure out, again, if there's a work anniversary, somebody's birthday's coming up, somebody got a new pet, somebody's kids, I don't know, something. Like just find a reason, a way to connect with each other. And you will find that that will increase the connection and collaboration with your team. Your team will be more likely to reach out to each other if they know the other person's the name of their dog. And I'm not kidding about this. The research is if you know so-and-so's dog, the name of their pet, you are more likely to reach out to them for help or a question. It's a psychology thing. It's about familiarity. So find opportunities or ways for your team to become more familiar in a nice, gentle way.
So there's a couple more comments coming in with examples. I know I've heard an example recently at DPS where they just have a set meeting. Nobody has to go to it. They just kind of jump into a Google Meet and chat during lunch sometimes. Here's Paula Huber says, we have a meeting once a month that anyone can join called Coffee Break. Melinda Young says, my team and I created a virtual water cooler in Google Chat to meet up during the day to share casual items, jokes, etc. So that's within the chat. You mentioned early on that people will work out how to balance teleworking, will work out conflicts with childcare incidents, etc. I'm trying to decide whether to say something to a newly teleworking employee about a childcare conflict that arose. So there's a challenge that somebody is facing. Do you have any comments for that?
Yeah, absolutely. Childcare is one of the number one issues that we have to manage a work-life balance. And if it's a new person to your team, absolutely bring that subject up. How are they doing? How does their office space look? What arrangements have they made? What do they feel the biggest challenges for them? Right? And before you espouse all of your wisdom and all of your advice, right, refrain and let them tell you what their solution is. Right? Because if you start telling them, well, make sure you put your child in daycare, or make sure you do this, or make sure you do that, right? They're going to feel judged, right? And they're not going to be as creative or come up with their own solutions. And the main goal here is they come up with their own solutions for their childcare needs, right? Only the mother or the family knows the best way to deal with those personal issues, those family conflict issues. And if we start telling people or giving them advice, we're going to stifle their creativity in a way of managing that situation that works for them. Because remember, you don't know what kind of family support they have. You don't know what resources are available to them. So may always ask and then ask again, right? How is that going? Do you need support? Where is there anybody else in your family that's managed this successfully? What do they do? right? Ask way more questions. I'm going to say ask 6 questions before you ever give your own advice. All right. And it's in service of allowing the person to come up with their own solution. Because as leaders, what is our role, right? We don't want to do everybody's job for them. Our role as leaders is to teach people to think and to think for themselves and get their own job done the way that works for them, as long as the outcome and the objectives are being met and the boundaries, right? We're working together. That is the goal. The goal isn't for you to solve everybody's problem. If you had to solve everybody's problem, you would never get your own work done.
So John Hagwood
Yeah.
just wanted to clarify something. He says, did you mean to ask what support do you need? I'm not sure what he's referring to there. Maybe you know.
Yeah, well, if we're talking about the childcare issue,
Yeah.
you could say how, how have you addressed this problem in the past? What have you done? What have you done so far that's working? What's not working? So I love the question, what's working? What's not working, right? Again, don't give your advice, don't give your input.
I get what John's saying. He's phrasing it in a way that it's not a closed
Okay.
question. So he's giving us a good
Okay,
example.
yeah. So, and they say, no, I don't need any support, right?
I have one more example here that I think is really interesting. Amanda Barr from DHHS says, we did a weekly recipe exchange. Each member of the team took turns to present their favorite recipe. I always made the recipe and took pictures and shared it the next week. Unfortunately, only a few others actually made the recipes, but that's kind of a fun thing.
Yeah.
Ashley Sumner also says, love these ideas for connection. Great reminder about how intentional it needs to be.
And these things don't happen by accident. That's why we're doing workshops and seminars on them, right? These don't happen naturally. In the general population, there's like 5% of us that are natural leaders that would do this automatically. The other 95% of us, we need to be intentional about this.
Well, it looks like we've come to probably a pretty good stopping point. Thank you, Angelique, for taking the time to put that together for us. I think we all learned a lot here. Again, next month, the 22nd, 10 a.m., Dr. Dan Chase will present on leading with emotional intelligence. If you haven't hit the link, it's a little bit up in the chat now. Go click on that, register, or you can wait for us to send it out to you. Thanks for your time and attention. Any last words, Angelique?
Oh, it was my pleasure to be able to deliver this off the shelf. No, I had a lot of fun, and I love the engagement piece. So thank you for all your comments.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.